November 19th, 1944. The waters off the Japanese coast were black as ink, disturbed only by the gentle roll of swells moving eastward toward the open Pacific. Beneath the surface, at periscope depth, Commander Richard O'Kane pressed his eye against the lens and swept the horizon one final time. What he saw through that narrow circle of magnified ocean would either make naval history or end his career in the most catastrophic way possible. For 4 days, USS Tang had been operating in what the Navy called the Devil's Backyard. These were Japanese home waters, patrolled by destroyers, aircraft, and coastal defense forces that had been hunting American submarines with increasing desperation. Every Allied submarine captain knew the statistics. The closer you got to Japan, the higher your chances of never coming home. The Japanese had learned hard lessons about submarine warfare over 3 years of combat, and they had turned their coastal waters into a killing ground for unwary submariners. But O'Kane wasn't unwary, and Tang wasn't just any submarine. She was the most successful submarine in the United States Navy, with a crew that had been forged through months of the most dangerous combat operations in the Pacific. They had already sunk more enemy ships than most submarines managed in their entire service lives. They had survived depth charge attacks that had sent other boats to the bottom. They had executed torpedo attacks in conditions that would have made veteran submarine commanders refuse the mission. Now they were about to attempt something that would either cement their legend or destroy them completely. Intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese convoy was approaching their position. Not just any convoy, but one of the heavily defended formations that the Japanese used to move critical supplies between their home islands and occupied territories. These convoys travelled with destroyer escorts, aircraft cover, and every defensive measure the Imperial Navy could provide. The problem was that Tang had already been operating for weeks. Her torpedo rooms held only 8 torpedoes, less than half her normal load. Her batteries were showing the strain of constant submerged operations. Her crew was exhausted from the relentless tension of combat patrols in enemy waters. Most submarine commanders would have headed home for resupply and rest. O'Kane had decided to stay and fight. The decision revealed everything about the man and the boat he commanded. Richard Hetherington O'Kane was not a typical Naval Academy graduate. Born in New Hampshire in 1911, he had earned his commission through grit and determination, rather than family connections or political influence. He understood that submarine warfare was fundamentally different from surface combat. It required patience, calculation, and the ability to make life or death decisions with incomplete information while under enormous pressure. But O'Kane possessed something even rarer than tactical skill. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to read enemy movements and predict convoy routes. His fellow submarine commanders called it intuition, but it was actually the result of obsessive study. O'Kane analysed every intelligence report, every patrol summary, every captured document that provided insight into Japanese naval operations. He understood their convoy schedules, their escort patterns, their communication procedures. He could predict where Japanese ships would be before their own commanders had finalised their orders. USS Tang herself was a Balao-class submarine, one of the most advanced underwater vessels in the world. She displaced 1,526 tons surfaced and 2,514 tons submerged. Her length of 311 feet and beam of 27 feet gave her the size and stability needed for long-range Pacific operations. 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines provided surface propulsion, while electric motors powered her submerged operations. Her maximum speed of 20 knots surfaced and 9 knots submerged made her faster than most Japanese escort vessels. Her armament was devastating. 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, could launch the deadly Mark 14 and Mark 18 torpedoes that had finally been perfected after years of technical problems. A 5-inch deck gun provided surface firepower, while 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns offered protection against air attack. But her real weapon was her crew of 85 men, who had been welded into a fighting unit through shared danger and absolute trust in their commander. The crew knew they were operating under conditions that pushed every system to its limits. Chief Torpedoman Floyd Caverly had been nursing their remaining torpedoes like a mother protecting her children. Each weapon represented their only chance of survival if they encountered enemy warships. electrician's mate Lawrence Savadkin monitored the battery systems that kept them alive underwater, knowing that power failure meant certain death. Sonar operator Sidney Jones listened to the ocean around them with the concentration of a musician detecting discord in a symphony. These men understood that submarine warfare in 1944 was fundamentally different from what it had been at the beginning of the war. Japanese anti-submarine capabilities had improved dramatically. Their destroyers carried advanced sonar equipment and devastating depth charge patterns. Their aircraft used radar and magnetic anomaly detectors to hunt submarines with scientific precision. Their convoy escorts followed tactical procedures that had been refined through bitter experience against American submarine attacks. The Japanese had also learned to use geography as a weapon. The waters around their home islands were shallow, confined, and perfectly suited for anti-submarine operations. Submarines had fewer places to hide and less room to maneuver. Every approach to a target convoy became a calculated risk that could easily turn into a death trap. American submarine commanders had learned to respect these waters through hard experience and heavy losses. But O'Kane had studied the Japanese defensive systems until he understood their weaknesses as well as their strengths. He knew that Japanese escorts were trained to follow specific patterns when attacked. He knew their sonar had blind spots that could be exploited by a submarine commander willing to take enormous risks. Most importantly, he knew that Japanese convoy commanders had become predictable in their efforts to avoid submarine attacks. The intelligence that had brought Tang to this position came from multiple sources that painted a picture of unprecedented opportunity. Radio intercepts indicated that a major convoy was moving through their area, carrying supplies that the Japanese war effort desperately needed. Photo reconnaissance suggested that this convoy included not just merchant vessels, but warships and transports that represented strategic targets. Most significantly, the convoy appeared to be following a route that would bring it directly through Tang's operating area. O'Kane had positioned his submarine along the projected convoy route with the precision of a chess master setting up a winning combination. He had calculated the timing, the approach angles, the escape routes, and the backup plans that might keep his crew alive if everything went wrong. He had briefed his officers on every contingency he could imagine and prepared them for split-second decisions that could mean the difference between victory and disaster. The crew understood the stakes. Success would not only add to their already impressive record of enemy ships sunk, but would demonstrate that American submarines could operate effectively even in the most heavily defended Japanese waters. Failure would likely mean the loss of one of the Navy's most successful submarines and most experienced crews. As O'Kane swept the horizon through his periscope, he was looking for the first signs of the convoy that intelligence had promised. The ocean appeared empty, but he knew that could change in minutes. Japanese convoys approached their destinations at specific times, following routes that had been planned to minimize their exposure to submarine attack. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and Tang would miss the convoy entirely. Too late, and they would find themselves trying to attack a formation that had already passed through their area and was moving toward the protection of Japanese coastal defenses. The atmosphere inside Tang was electric with anticipation. Every man knew they were about to attempt something extraordinary. They had trained for this moment through months of increasingly dangerous operations. They had developed the skills, the confidence, and the teamwork necessary to execute complex attacks under the most difficult conditions. Now they would discover whether that preparation was sufficient for what lay ahead. Through his periscope, O'Kane began to see the first indications that their intelligence had been accurate. Smoke on the horizon, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, suggested that ships were approaching their position. The course and speed appeared to match the predictions that had brought Tang to this exact location. Everything was developing according to plan. But O'Kane knew that plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. The next few hours would test every skill he had developed, every lesson he had learned, and every ounce of courage his crew possessed. They were about to discover whether one American submarine could accomplish what seemed impossible against odds that would have deterred less determined men. The hunt was about to begin. The first ship appeared as a shadow against the horizon at 230 hours. Through the periscope, O'Kane watched as the formation took shape in the darkness. What he saw exceeded every optimistic projection from naval intelligence. This wasn't just a convoy. It was a floating city of Japanese merchant vessels, tankers, and warships stretching across miles of ocean. The lead elements consisted of 4 destroyers in a screening formation, their hulls cutting through the swells with the purposeful movement of warships on high alert. Behind them came the prize targets, 6 large cargo vessels, their holds packed with the raw materials and manufactured goods that kept Japan's war machine functioning. 2 fleet tankers rode low in the water, their cargo of precious fuel oil representing months of refined petroleum that Japanese industry desperately needed. But what made O'Kane's pulse quicken was the composition of the escort force. In addition to the destroyers, he counted 2 escort carriers, their flight decks visible even in the pre-dawn gloom. These weren't the massive fleet carriers that dominated headlines, but smaller vessels designed specifically for convoy protection. Their aircraft could hunt submarines with deadly efficiency once daylight arrived. The tactical situation was unlike anything Tang had faced before. The convoy was following a zigzag pattern designed to frustrate submarine attacks. Every few minutes, the entire formation would execute a coordinated turn, changing course by 20 or 30 degrees before settling on a new heading. The timing was irregular, making it nearly impossible to predict where the ships would be when torpedoes reached their targets. O'Kane studied the formation through his periscope, his mind working through calculations that would determine whether his crew lived or died. The convoy was moving at 14 knots, faster than most merchant formations. The escorts were positioned to provide overlapping coverage, with destroyers patrolling ahead and on the flanks, while the carriers remained in the centre of the formation. Any submarine attempting to penetrate this defensive screen would have to navigate through multiple layers of protection. The crew of Tang waited in absolute silence as their commander analysed the tactical picture. In the forward torpedo room, Chief Cavalier and his team had loaded their remaining weapons and stood ready to fire. The Mark 14 torpedoes represented 3 years of technical development and combat refinement. Each weapon carried a 643-pound warhead capable of breaking the back of any merchant vessel or inflicting crippling damage on warships. But 8 torpedoes meant 8 chances. Miss with those weapons and Tang would be defenseless except for her ability to run and hide. The margin for error was non-existent. Every shot had to count, every calculation had to be perfect, every decision had to be executed flawlessly. O'Kane made his choice with the cold calculation that separated exceptional submarine commanders from those who never returned from patrol. Instead of attacking the convoy from a safe distance, he decided to penetrate the escort screen and engage the targets from close range. The decision violated every principle of submarine safety, but it offered the only realistic chance of achieving the kind of devastating attack that could justify the enormous risks they were taking. Tang began her approach at WO2 for 5 hours, running submerged at periscope depth with her electric motors providing silent propulsion. O'Kane conned the submarine personally, making minute course corrections to avoid detection by the patrolling destroyers. The sonar crew tracked the escort vessels while plotting their movements on charts that showed every ship in the convoy. The approach required 40 minutes of nerve-wracking manoeuvring. Tang had to slip between 2 destroyers that were patrolling less than 3,000 yards apart. The margin for error was measured in hundreds of yards. Too far to port, and they would be detected by the destroyer on the left flank. Too far to starboard, and the escort on the right would pick them up on sonar. O'Kane guided his submarine through the gap with the precision of a surgeon performing delicate operations. The crew barely breathed as they listened to the sound of destroyer propellers passing overhead. Japanese sonar was pinging actively, searching for exactly what Tang was attempting. Each ping represented the possibility of detection and the depth charge attack that would follow within minutes. At 0325 hours, Tang reached firing position inside the convoy formation. O'Kane raised his periscope and found himself surrounded by targets. The nearest cargo vessel was less than 800 yards away, so close he could see details of her superstructure in the darkness. A tanker rode at the same distance to starboard, her cargo of fuel oil representing a strategic target worth enormous risk. But the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Dawn was less than 2 hours away, and daylight would bring aircraft from the escort carriers. The convoy was maintaining its zigzag pattern, making firing solutions extremely difficult to calculate. Most dangerous of all, the destroyers were beginning to tighten their patrol patterns as they approached the Japanese coast. O'Kane made the decision that defined his reputation as the most aggressive submarine commander in the Pacific Fleet. Instead of firing a spread of torpedoes at long range and hoping for hits, he maneuvered Tang even closer to his targets. At 600 yards, the range was so close that torpedo running time would be measured in seconds rather than minutes. The enemy ships would have no opportunity to detect the incoming weapons and take evasive action. The first torpedo left Tang's forward tubes at 3:31 hours, aimed at the leading cargo vessel. The Mark 14 ran straight and true, its wake barely visible in the darkness. 45 seconds later, the weapon struck the merchant ship just forward of her bridge. The explosion lit up the convoy formation like a photograph flash, revealing the full extent of the target array that surrounded Tang. The cargo vessel began listing immediately as seawater flooded through the massive hole torn in her side. Her crew scrambled to launch lifeboats, while the ship settled by the head. But O'Kane was already lining up his second shot, targeting the tanker that had been steaming parallel to his first victim. The second torpedo fired at 332 hours. This weapon struck the tanker amidships, igniting her cargo in a fireball that could be seen for 20 miles. The explosion was so violent that it shattered windows on nearby ships and sent burning fuel oil cascading into the ocean. The tanker broke in half and sank within minutes, taking her entire crew with her. But the attack had only begun. O'Kane swung Tang's bow toward a third target, a large transport that was attempting to escape the chaos by increasing speed. The Japanese ship was making emergency turns, trying to present a difficult target while her crew prepared for what they knew was coming. The third torpedo, fired at 3:34 hours, struck the transport just below her waterline. The weapon detonated in her engine room, destroying her propulsion and leaving her dead in the water. She began settling by the stern as her crew abandoned ship in whatever boats and rafts they could deploy. By now, the convoy formation was disintegrating as individual ships took evasive action. The destroyers were racing toward the area where the torpedoes had originated, their sonar pinging frantically as they searched for the submarine that had caused such devastation. Alarm bells were ringing throughout the convoy as ships that had been steaming in orderly formation scattered in all directions. O'Kane had seconds to make his next decision. 3 ships were sinking or sunk, but 5 torpedoes remained in Tang's tubes. The escort carriers were launching aircraft despite the darkness, their flight crews accepting enormous risks to get into the air and hunt the submarine that was destroying their convoy. The destroyers were closing in with depth charges ready, and sonar operators who had finally detected Tang's position. The smart decision would have been to go deep and escape while confusion still reigned in the convoy formation. Any other submarine commander would have been satisfied with 3 confirmed kills and a successful penetration of a heavily defended convoy. But O'Kane saw opportunity where others would have seen overwhelming danger. 2 cargo vessels remained within torpedo range, and one of the escort carriers had manoeuvred into a position where she presented a perfect target. The carrier was worth more than all the merchant vessels combined. Her aircraft posed a threat to every American submarine operating in the region. Destroying her would save Allied lives and eliminate a significant Japanese military asset. The decision to continue the attack demonstrated everything that made O'Kane the most successful submarine commander in the Pacific. He possessed the technical skill to execute complex attacks under impossible conditions. He had the tactical vision to see opportunities that others missed. Most importantly, he had the courage to risk everything for the chance to achieve something extraordinary. Tang's 4th torpedo fired at 3:37 hours, aimed at one of the remaining cargo vessels. The weapon ran true and struck the merchant ship in her forward hold. The explosion sent cargo and debris flying hundreds of feet into the air, while the ship began her final plunge toward the bottom of the Pacific. The 5th torpedo followed 30 seconds later, targeting the 2nd cargo vessel. This shot hit the ship in her engine room, breaking her keel and causing her to jackknife before disappearing beneath the waves. 5 ships in 6 minutes, a rate of destruction that exceeded anything in submarine warfare history. But O'Kane wasn't finished. The escort carrier remained within range, her flight deck crowded with aircraft that would soon be hunting Tang and every other American submarine in the region. She represented the kind of target that justified every risk, the kind of victory that could change the course of naval operations throughout the Pacific. The attack on the carrier would require everything Tang and her crew had learned through months of combat. The ship was maneuvering aggressively, protected by destroyers that were now fully alert to the submarine threat. Aircraft were already in the air, their pilots searching for the underwater predator that had turned their convoy into a burning graveyard. O'Kane began his approach on the carrier, knowing that success or failure would determine not just his reputation, but whether his crew survived the next hour. The escort carrier loomed through O'Kane's periscope like a floating fortress, her flight deck silhouetted against the burning wreckage of the convoy she had failed to protect. At 1,200 yards, she was close enough that he could see individual aircraft spotted on her deck, their engines warming as flight crews prepared for takeoff. In minutes, those planes would be airborne and hunting Tang with every sensor and weapon at their disposal. But something was wrong with the tactical picture. The carrier was turning toward Tang rather than away, her bow swinging in a wide arc that would bring her directly across the submarine's position. O'Kane studied the maneuver through his periscope, trying to understand what the Japanese captain was attempting. The movement made no tactical sense from a defensive standpoint, but it created an opportunity that no submarine commander could ignore. The carrier was presenting her broadside, the largest possible target profile, at a range where torpedo failure was virtually impossible. Her captain was either making a catastrophic error in judgment or executing some desperate maneuver that O'Kane couldn't interpret. Either way, the result was the same. Tang had been handed a perfect firing solution on one of the most valuable targets in the Japanese Navy. O'Kane ordered his torpedo crew to prepare the final 3 weapons. Chief Cavalry's voice came through the intercom with the calm professionalism that had carried them through dozens of attacks. Tubes 7, 8, and 9 were loaded and ready. The Mark 14 torpedoes had been armed and their depth settings checked. Everything was prepared for what might be the most important attack of Tang's career. But the tactical situation was deteriorating with every second that passed. Japanese destroyers were converging on Tang's position from 3 directions, their sonar pulses growing stronger as they closed the range. The submarine had been detected, and depth charges would start falling within minutes. Aircraft from the undamaged escort carrier were already circling overhead, their radar and magnetic anomaly detectors searching for the submarine that had devastated their convoy. O'Kane calculated the geometry of the attack with the precision of a mathematician solving a complex equation. The carrier was still turning, her speed approximately 18 knots, her course predictable for the next 90 seconds. The range was closing to 800 yards, point-blank distance for a submarine torpedo attack. The firing solution was perfect, but the window of opportunity was measured in heartbeats. The first torpedo left Tang's tube at 0341 hours, aimed at the carrier's forward engine room. O'Kane watched through his periscope as the weapon's wake cut through the dark water, its path arrow straight toward the massive target. The Mark 14 ran hot and normal, its sophisticated guidance system maintaining course despite the rough seas that had begun to develop as the morning progressed. 42 seconds after firing, the torpedo struck the escort carrier just below her waterline. The explosion was unlike anything the crew of Tang had ever experienced. The detonation of 643 pounds of high explosive against the carrier's hull created a sound that resonated through the submarine's steel structure like a giant bell being struck. The shock wave was so powerful that it knocked several crew members off their feet and caused light bulbs throughout the boat to shatter. Through his periscope, O'Kane watched the carrier stagger under the impact. A massive column of water and debris rose from her port side, climbing nearly 200 feet into the air before cascading back onto her flight deck. The ship immediately began listing to port as thousands of tons of seawater poured through the breach in her hull. Aircraft that had been preparing for takeoff began sliding across the tilted deck toward the ocean. But one hit, even from a Mark 14 torpedo, was rarely enough to sink a warship the size of an escort carrier. These vessels were built to survive battle damage, with compartmentalization and damage control systems designed to keep them afloat despite severe flooding. O'Kane knew he needed to hit her again, and quickly, before her crew could contain the damage and restore stability. The second torpedo fired 30 seconds later, aimed at the carrier's stern where her propulsion machinery was located. This shot was more difficult because the ship was now listing heavily, and her course had become erratic as her helmsman struggled to maintain control. But the range was so close that minor course deviations couldn't affect the torpedo's accuracy. The second Mark 14 struck the carrier in her after-engine room, creating another devastating explosion that sent more aircraft tumbling into the sea. The twin hits had broken the ship's back, causing structural damage that no amount of damage control could repair. She began settling by both bow and stern simultaneously, her hull taking on the distinctive hogged appearance that indicated complete structural failure. O'Kane prepared to fire his final torpedo, but as he watched through his periscope, he realized it wasn't necessary. The escort carrier was already beyond saving. Her flight deck was awash, her aircraft either in the water or sliding inexorably toward destruction. Most of her crew was abandoning ship, launching life rafts and lifeboats in a desperate attempt to escape before their vessel made her final plunge. Instead of wasting his last torpedo on a ship that was already doomed, O'Kane made a tactical decision that demonstrated his understanding of submarine warfare strategy. He kept the weapon for self-defense, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether Tang escaped or joined her victims on the bottom of the Pacific. The Japanese destroyers had triangulated Tang's position with deadly accuracy. 3 ships were converging on the submarine from different directions, their sonar operators providing continuous tracking information to the depth charge crews standing ready on their sterns. The first pattern of charges hit the water at 344 hours, just 2 minutes after Tang's final torpedo attack. The depth charges exploded in a sequence that lasted nearly 30 seconds, each detonation creating a hammer blow that threatened to crush Tang's pressure hull. The submarine shook violently as shockwaves propagated through the water, causing instruments to fail and equipment to break loose from their mountings. Emergency lighting flickered throughout the boat as electrical systems strained under the punishment. O'Kane ordered Tang to go deep, diving toward the thermal layer that might provide some protection from the destroyer's sonar. The submarine's bow angled downward as compressed air was blown from her ballast tanks, and seawater flooded in to replace it. But depth was a double-edged sword in these waters. The ocean floor was less than 300 feet below, leaving little room for the deep diving that had saved American submarines in other theaters. Chief of the boat William Bellinger coordinated damage control efforts as the submarine dove through repeated depth charge attacks. The Japanese destroyers were persistent and methodical, dropping their weapons in carefully calculated patterns designed to bracket Tang's probable position. Each pattern forced the submarine deeper, closer to the crushing pressure that would implode her hull if she exceeded her design limits. At 250 feet, Tang reached the thermal layer that O'Kane had been seeking. The abrupt change in water temperature created a barrier that disrupted sonar waves, making it difficult for the Japanese destroyers to maintain contact. For the first time since beginning their attack, the crew had a moment to assess their situation and plan their escape. The damage reports were better than anyone had dared hope. Despite the pounding from depth charges, Tang's hull remained intact, and her major systems were functioning. The electric motors that provided underwater propulsion were operating normally. The ballast and trim systems that controlled her buoyancy were undamaged. Most importantly, her battery banks were still providing the power needed for submerged operations. But their position remained desperate. The submarine was trapped in shallow water with multiple destroyers hunting her from above. Aircraft from the surviving escort carrier were dropping sonar buoys and using radar to detect any sign of the submarine that had devastated their convoy. Every minute they remained in the area increased the chances that they would be detected and destroyed. O'Kane made the decision that would either save his crew or doom them. Instead of trying to escape immediately, he ordered Tang to remain stationary on the ocean floor, using the thermal layer and the confusion above to mask their position. The submarine settled onto the sandy bottom with a gentle bump that resonated through her hull, then went completely silent. The crew shut down all non-essential systems and equipment. Ventilation fans stopped turning. Pumps ceased operating. Even conversations were conducted in whispers to avoid creating any sound that might be detected by Japanese. Hydrophones. Tang became a steel tomb lying motionless on the bottom of the Pacific while her enemies searched frantically overhead. For 3 hours, the submarine remained hidden while Japanese forces scoured the area. The destroyers continued their search patterns, dropping occasional depth charges at contacts that proved to be schools of fish or thermal anomalies. Aircraft circled endlessly, their crews growing increasingly frustrated as they failed to locate the submarine that had inflicted such devastating losses on their convoy. During those 3 hours, O'Kane and his crew listened to the sounds of their victory. The escort carrier's death throes were audible through Tang's hull as the massive ship broke apart and sank. Secondary explosions echoed through the water as her aviation fuel ignited and her ammunition magazines detonated. The sounds of men dying and ships sinking provided a grim soundtrack to their enforced silence. At 7:30 hours, with dawn breaking over the Pacific, the Japanese search forces finally began to withdraw. The destroyers had exhausted their depth charge supplies and needed to return to port for resupply. The aircraft were running low on fuel and could no longer maintain their search patterns. Most importantly, other American submarines were operating in the area, and Japanese commanders couldn't concentrate all their anti-submarine assets on a single contact. O'Kane waited another hour before ordering Tang to surface. The submarine rose slowly from the depths, her crew checking systems and preparing for whatever they might encounter on the surface. When her conning tower broke through into the morning sunlight, they found themselves alone on an ocean littered with debris from the convoy they had destroyed. The scene that greeted them was unlike anything in submarine warfare history. 6 ships had been sunk in a single attack, including an escort carrier that represented one of Japan's most valuable naval assets. Oil slicks stretched for miles in every direction, marked by lifeboats and life rafts carrying the survivors of O'Kane's devastating assault. Pieces of wreckage bobbed in the swells, from aircraft that had been aboard the carrier to cargo containers that had spilled from the merchant vessels. But Tang's crew had no time to survey the destruction they had caused. Japanese search forces would return as soon as additional ships and aircraft became available. The submarine needed to clear the area immediately and begin the long journey back to Pearl Harbor, where their report would astound even the most optimistic intelligence analysts. As Tang set course for home, running on the surface to recharge her batteries and make maximum speed away from Japanese waters, O'Kane began composing the patrol report that would make naval history. 6 ships sunk in a single attack, including a major warship and 5 merchant vessels carrying strategic materials. The tonnage destroyed exceeded 40,000 tons, representing months of Japanese industrial production and irreplaceable military assets. The tactical execution had been flawless, but the strategic implications were even more significant. Tang had demonstrated that American submarines could penetrate the most heavily defended Japanese formations and inflict catastrophic losses even in enemy home waters. The psychological impact on Japanese naval commanders would be enormous, forcing them to divert additional resources to convoy protection and limiting their ability to conduct offensive operations. More importantly, the attack proved that American submarine crews had reached a level of skill and confidence that made them virtually unstoppable when properly equipped and trained. The combination of advanced torpedoes, sophisticated sonar, and experienced crews had created an underwater force capable of challenging Japanese naval supremacy throughout the Pacific. But success came with a price that extended far beyond the risks accepted by Tang and her crew. The aggressive tactics that had made the attack possible could not be sustained indefinitely, without eventually encountering Japanese forces prepared for such assaults. The element of surprise that had protected American submarines during the early years of the war was gradually being eroded as Japanese anti-submarine capabilities improved. O'Kane understood these broader implications as Tang raced eastward towards safety. The war was entering a new phase where submarine operations would become increasingly dangerous and complex. Success would require not just courage and skill, but also the kind of tactical innovation that had made their recent attack possible. The crew of Tang had written a new chapter in submarine warfare, but they had also raised the stakes for every American submarine operating in the Pacific. Japanese commanders would study their attack methods and develop countermeasures designed to prevent similar disasters. The next time an American submarine attempted such an assault, the defenders would be ready with improved tactics and more effective weapons. As the Hawaiian Islands appeared on the horizon 5 days later, Tang carried with her more than just the satisfaction of a successful patrol. She carried proof that American submarines had become the dominant underwater force in the Pacific, capable of operations that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The patrol report that Lieutenant Commander O'Kane submitted upon Tang's return to Pearl Harbor sent shockwaves through the Pacific Fleet Command structure that reverberated all the way to Washington. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Pacific Fleet submarines, read the document 3 times before accepting its contents. 6 ships sunk in a single engagement, including an escort carrier, represented a level of tactical success that exceeded every previous submarine achievement in the Pacific theater. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real significance lay in the tactical innovations that had made such devastating results possible. O'Kane had demonstrated that American submarines could penetrate heavily defended convoy formations and survive to fight again. He had proved that aggressive tactics, when executed with precision and courage, could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Most importantly, he had shown that Japanese naval defences, despite 3 years of refinement and improvement, remained vulnerable to determined submarine commanders willing to accept extraordinary risks. The intelligence value of Tang's patrol extended far beyond the ships she had destroyed. O'Kane's detailed observations of Japanese convoy procedures, escort tactics, and anti-submarine countermeasures provided Pacific Fleet planners with information that would influence submarine operations throughout the remaining months of the war. His report documented specific weaknesses in Japanese defensive formations that other submarine commanders could exploit in future attacks. Japanese reaction to the convoy disaster was immediate and severe. The loss of 6 ships in a single engagement represented more than just material destruction. It demonstrated that American submarines had achieved a level of operational capability that threatened Japan's ability to maintain maritime communications between the home islands and occupied territories. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant marine crews was devastating, with many experienced sailors requesting transfers to shore duty rather than face American submarines in their own coastal waters. Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, convened an emergency conference of senior naval officers to address the submarine threat. The meeting, held in Tokyo just days after Tang's attack, produced new defensive measures that would reshape Japanese convoy operations for the remainder of the war. Escort requirements were doubled for all major formations. Aircraft patrols were extended to provide continuous coverage of shipping routes. Most significantly, convoy schedules were randomized to prevent American intelligence from predicting ship movements with the accuracy that had made Tang's attack possible. But these defensive improvements came at enormous cost to Japanese naval operations. The additional escorts required for convoy protection meant fewer destroyers available for fleet operations. The extended air patrols consumed aviation fuel that Japan could barely afford to waste. The randomized scheduling disrupted industrial production schedules that depended on predictable delivery of raw materials and manufactured goods. Tang's success also influenced American submarine doctrine in ways that extended throughout the Pacific Fleet. O'Kane's aggressive tactics were studied and incorporated into training programs for new submarine commanders. His methods of convoy penetration became standard procedure for boats operating in heavily defended waters. Most importantly, his demonstration that escort carriers could be successfully attacked encouraged other submarine commanders to target these valuable vessels whenever opportunity presented itself. Commander Richard O'Kane and USS Tang had accomplished something that would echo through naval history for generations. In 4 devastating days, they had proven that American submarine warfare had evolved from desperate early war struggles into a precision instrument capable of crippling enemy operations in their own home waters. The 6 ships sent to the bottom represented more than tonnage statistics. They embodied the transformation of the Pacific War itself, where Japanese naval supremacy had given way to American dominance beneath the waves. Tang's crew had written their names in blood and steel across the Pacific, demonstrating that courage, skill, and determination could overcome any odds when wielded by men who refused to accept defeat.